Trey, Marshall, welcome to the show, guys. It's great to visit with you.
Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
my pleasure, guys. My pleasure. So, where are you joining us from today?
We're in the Rio Grande Valley, deep South Texas. We're in Brownsville today, although we live in a little town called San Benito.
Okay, San Benito. I think I've been there. One time when I was telling you I turkey hunt down in the Uteria outside of Raymondville, and my buddy had a lease, and I know we went through San Benito, and it was this really unique place where the the sand the ranch was all white sand, really, like, and you had to drive. It was something like I've never seen in Texas. And there's vegetation growing in it. Obviously they have cattle and stuff there, but it was hard to drive a truck through. And I don't know, is that reminiscent of where you guys are at?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, there's
uh,
so many unique places down here that are unlike anywhere else in Texas for sure. I don't know about the white sand specifically, although the place we're hunting on now on the El Sal's is strange just because there's so much sand and you can just as likely see a bunch of crabs getting out of the way of the Jeep as you can, rabbits and nightjars. So,
yeah,
you know,
but
it,
but this place that we went, it wasn't like it was right next to the coast. At some point in history it had to have been, right?
yeah.
But it ain't anymore. Very unique. There's so many different geographical and just surprisingly unique things you're going to find in Texas. It's so diverse. You never know.
That's
But
the truth.
mhm. Well, yeah, thanks for jumping on, and I wanted to visit with you guys because y'all had a pretty scary situation here recently. Marshall, how old are you?
I'm 13.
13. Okay. And how long have you been hunting with your dad?
13 years.
Right? Yeah, my son just turned 11, and I have pictures of him in a stroller in the dove field. My wife's at work. I'm like, well, I'm going dove hunting, so I guess my infant son is going dove hunting too.
Sounds
Uh,
like us.
yeah, yeah. So have you shot what all have you hunted for yourself so far?
I've shot a couple bucks. I've shot some doe. I haven't
Mhm.
got a bull guy yet, but we're gonna try. I've shot a cow guy, coyote.
Nice, nice. Do you guys turkey hunt too?
Yes, sir. We don't do much of the spring,
Mhm.
calling them thing, but it's more, just opportunity. If,
If you
opportunity
see one at a
mass
deer
shooting
feeder,
during the
right?
regular season. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, so where do you guys hunt at?
Well, for years on the Uter on the all the Uteria or a bunch of the Uteria ranches, and now we're on a lease that basically goes from all the south side of 186 east of Raymondville out toward Port Mansfield.
Uh-huh.
So about 48,000 acres, just a huge, very vast place, which when you're having an incident like we did recently, you realize just how big it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to
And
get to trying to get a kid safe.
yeah. Well, and before we get into that, and I don't want to get too political here, but have you noticed, being right on the border there, have you noticed like a lot of illegal activity on your lease or not?
No, not specifically on this lease. The leases that are tighter to the highway that runs north south 77 through the main ranch land, I think those end up being more the corridors to get past the like Sarita checkpoint in those areas. We saw way more traffic on the Uturias, frankly, than and got a bunch of
Mhm.
stories about just having watching people run down a Sendera or whatever there. But here we really haven't seen anything
Yeah.
like
Well, I'm taking my son next week to my buddy's place in Encinal to try to get him a late season buck, and they found a dead guy on their place. He died of heat exhaustion. He was just sitting under a tree, just dead. And then one time they pulled in the main gate, and this is all low fence place, and they've I'm trying to remember what he saw footprints. Well, what he realized was the guy was there, but the footprints were around the feeder, and they figured out that they were charging their cell phones off of the feeder battery.
that. Oh, well,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
we've seen evidence where you've got empty water jugs and you can kind of see where people have stopped and
Mhm.
camped and stuff that we've never run into anybody on the El Sauz actually.
Yeah. Well, how he knew they were charging their cell phone was they obviously got a picture of him, and he had this cord, and he was standing by the feeder. He's like, he put two and two together. He's like, that guy's charging his cell phone off the deer feeder.
That's unreal.
Yeah. So you guys what were you hunting when the accident actually happened?
Well, I was trying to shoot just like a pig or maybe a big buck with my, or a javelina with my bow.
Uh-huh.
And a javelina walked in.
And you shot it.
And I shot it, and then it ran off down my right side. And I tried to, it was a good shot. It would have probably died if I just let it bleed out, but I followed it up. I found him under this tree that was kind of grown over, and crouched under, and his eyes opened, and he was just like on top of me in like a half a second.
Wow. What do you think a javelina weighs? 40 pounds? 50 pounds? Something like that?
This was a big male. I found it the next morning after this whole thing happened, actually about 8 or 10 feet from his hat laying in the dust. As we left, I mean, when I went and got him, we obviously left all of his gear in the field. So I was going back to try to retrieve everything. But I mean, it had died right there under the same little canopy overhang of brush that where this whole thing happened. But I don't know, I'd say, 35, 40 pounds, something like that. This was definitely on the bigger size.
And I don't think people realize the size of the cutters on these things, especially a big boar.
Not only the size, but how, we paid more attention. I mean, I've been around them my whole life, literally, but you pay more attention after you see what they are capable of doing. And the way those jaws come together, it's like a perfect shear, so it's just shredded his arm.
So did you stumble back and it actually got on top of you, Marshall?
Well, I stumbled back after it had gotten off me because I had to stab it a couple of times with my knife that was on my belt. And I still have my knife in my hand. And I went out the other side of this overgrown tree, tripped over this young sapling and broke it, and threw my knife somewhere. And we're still trying to look for it. But
So he got you on your arm.
Yes.
And was that the only place where he actually cut you?
We think so. Well, yeah, he just got my arm, but I have 2 little punctures on my leg, but we think that's from when I fell over the tree. I cut myself on the tree a little bit.
Oh, wow. And immediately just bleeding?
Pretty much.
And so what went through your mind at that point? Like, did you know you were hurt bad?
When it first happened, I just saw the top, and there were like little cuts that weren't too bad. And then I flipped it over, and it was just wide open, and it was pretty scary.
I'm sure. And so how far away were you, Trey? And how did that play out after he's been wounded by this javelina?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a story with a lot of, 2020 hindsight takeaways, but I was too far away. I'll put it that way. I mean, I was probably 10 minutes by Polaris, hunting his little brother for a cow nilgai, and we were just about to pull the trigger when one of my closest, best friends who I own a boat with, who I'd left in the Polaris, came. I saw this just, cloud of dust with him coming up, and he blew up our whole nilgai hunt. And I thought, this can't be good. He had gotten the call from Marshall on my phone, which I had left in the Polaris. And he's like, we gotta go. And so it was probably the longest 10-minute Polaris ride. I basically flew a Polaris to try to, get to him as quick as I could, and FaceTimed him on the way just because I wanted to see what he was dealing with. And as soon as FaceTime connected, I mean, it was like something out of Lord of the Flies. And, I mean, he had his shirt off, and his hair was all matted with blood, had blood all over his face, and, mud on him and stuff. And he had his belt around his arm, and he said, "Dad, you got to help me." And in a way that, for all the dads out there, I mean, that I will never forget. And, I know how tough a kid he is, but it was, I said, elevate it, sit down, I'm coming, you stay awake. I think it was the only other thing I said. And I mean, we just basically did everything to move heaven.
Did you stay on the phone the whole time?
I didn't stay on the phone the whole time because we were just going to make so much noise.
Uh-huh.
That's the side by side just so loud, and I said, I'm
Yeah.
coming, and
I'm
uh,
sure that was the longest 10 minutes of your life.
it really was. It honestly was. And I've been in a few situations like that before, just hunting around the world over, and different things, but nothing like where it's your own kid. I mean, it's, different level of
Uh-huh.
focus.
And Marshall, how did you know at 13 years old to make a tourniquet?
Well, we've been hunting and fishing for a while, and I think we've talked about it before. But
Uh-huh.
I knew it was used as to to stop bleeding.
Yeah. And so you put it above the wound and tighten it up
Yep, I put it kind of right here.
right on your like a bicep area. Man. Well, I mean, that's smart on you. I don't know that a lot of 13-year-old kids would have the knowledge to take their belt off and put it above the wound, you know. I don't know. Do you think that it saved his life?
Um, I really think I don't know. The truth is, Cable, I mean, thank God this was not an arterial bleed. I thought
Uh-huh.
it might be when I first saw him because there was just so much blood. I mean,
Yeah.
he left a blood trail that was kind of unbelievable. And I think if it had been arterial, I don't think we would have gotten to him at all. And that was actually in my mind on the drive because when I saw it, I was thinking, he's not going to have it tight enough, even if,
Yeah.
if that's what it is. But as soon as we saw it, I mean, we wrenched it tighter and we were still 15 minutes from camp probably, but I'd kind of gotten a little bit of the mindset, well, I'm only 15 minutes from camp, but as it turns out, 15 minutes is a heck of a long time when your kid's, bleeding to death.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and
So
in spite of having all the first aid trauma kits and stuff in the boats and places where you think something like this is going to happen, I didn't really have what I needed.
I don't think I mean I have one in my truck, a basic first aid kit, right? Which I just drive the truck around the leases. So I have that covered. And then when I'm in the backcountry, I have one. But it's still, say you drop your kid off and just like you, like the first aid kit doesn't stay with the kid, right? It's still far enough away where it might be an issue. Uh, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about my own situation. Would I have the first aid kit close enough to Henry, for example? I don't know. But I'm going to have a talk with him about what to do if he needs to make a tourniquet. Like I don't, he's just turned 11. I've never had that conversation with him. That's why I wanted to have you guys on because I think it's so important.
It really is. And, I've since obviously the stocking stuffer of our house for 2023 was the cat tourniquet. I don't know how many we bought at this point and
Uh,
given away, but I had two on the catamaran where we're spearfishing off of and that kind of stuff. I mean, I have all that stuff in that place where you think somebody's going to get a shaft through their leg or get bit by something,
uh,
but didn't have it in the Polaris. I mean, and honestly, just the tourniquet, once we got to him, would have changed this thing completely because a belt sounds good, but you just can't keep the pressure consistent. So it was my buddy was sitting in the back seat basically holding his arm out and holding the tourniquet with one hand, and he had his elbow like this and was keeping Marshall awake the whole drive back, sitting behind me saying, hey buddy, what, tell me about that javelina, just talking to him the whole way back to the camp. And I only glanced back a couple of times because I was so focused on driving, but there were probably twice where I just felt like I had to look back to make sure he was alive, honestly.
yeah,
That a couple of glimpses that you'll understand as a dad, you'll never forget a couple of those mental images from that evening. I was going really kicking myself for not having a tourniquet because with it not being arterial, in spite of the fact that I could see his bone down into this 2-inch laceration that was just, I mean, this thing just flayed his arm open. Um, a tourniquet would have been a game changer here.
So once you get back to camp, what happens next?
Well, we had 3 gates to get through from where he was bit, and this thing actually grabbed him and shook him, and Marshall's had to stab it to get it off of him. But we at the very first gate, I called the the ranch manager, for lack of a better word, and told her what we were coming in with, really quickly. So she was calling 911 and getting the ambulance en route, because I knew that was going to be paramount, because we were far enough away that if we didn't have significant help on arrival, we were going to be potentially dealing with a fatality.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was doing that, and we just were throwing gates open and leaving them open and going as quick as we could. And really, I just have to thank God that there were two anesthesiologists who were there hunting from Austin, who were in camp at the time that she rounded up. We still didn't really have a proper tourniquet, but as I pulled through the gate, which they were smart enough, the last gate at the camp that they were smart enough to open for us, which I've never come through that gate quite so fast as we did that night. But I mean, we came in like it was a full on race car pit stop, and there were probably 15 people right there at what we call processing, where you bring nilgai and stuff in. And I mean, as soon as I hit the brakes, there were people on both sides of the Polaris pulling him out, and we were transferring him very quickly to the back of a pickup truck. And that was honestly probably the scariest part, because I had wrestled with the idea of, I didn't have enough knowledge, Cable, to know whether I should lay him down in the back of the Polaris, or whether, because I thought, well, maybe in this situation with this wound where it is feet up didn't make sense to me just intuitively. And so I didn't do that. But in retrospect, I was supposed to lay him down and have his feet elevated. But as soon as we got him out of the Polaris and he stood up, he passed out and had a mini seizure and started making noises and was bleeding on the caliche. And I literally thought at that point I was going to watch my son die on this caliche road at camp. But these two anesthesiologists were pretty amazing. I mean, the one guy just grabbed him by the arm where he could put pressure directly on where the brachial artery is. And they switched the tourniquet over to, or they switched the leather belt that Marshall had been using to sort of, one of those webbing belts that I think they could maintain better pressure on. And we got him in the back of that truck. And it was just kind of an unbelievable situation at that point. But those two doctors were truly amazing. Dr. Kim is one of their names, and I haven't been able to talk to him because he left early the next morning, so I never saw him. And Marshall was in surgery that night, until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So we were tied up, but then it was just a crazy truck ride to get out on 186 and meet the ambulance, which we met on the shoulder, and, did a big U-turn, flagged them down. Apparently I was trying to wave down the ambulance and almost fell out of the back of the truck. Marshall told me this whole story later. I didn't remember any of this, that part of it. And then you think, you're going to be in.
But he's back in with the living now. Like, you said he passed out, so he came to.
He did, but at some point, I mean, I was up near his head in the bed of this pickup truck that we had transferred him to from the Polaris. And so I'm sort of cradling, trying to hold his, sort of C-spine area and everything still. And I'm talking to him upside down, just basically telling him how much I loved him and hey, buddy, you got to stay with me.
God, you're making me tear up. Jeez.
Dude, it was like, it was a crazy time for us, because Marshall's not the chattiest guy in the world, but we probably said more with fewer words that night on the ride, in that ambulance than we ever have in 13 years.
Yeah, man. So you get to the hospital in Raymondville, or where was the closest hospital?
We actually blew straight through Raymondville. The EMTs were from, the ambulance was from Valley Baptist, which is really the closest real trauma center that we've got. Okay. Harlingen, for folks that don't know, from where we are, I mean, it's a solid 45-minute ride. And I mean, that was really, really long, because you have, at least I have this, I had this thought that once you got to an ambulance, you were going to be in the hands of professional care. And depending on where you are, that may not necessarily be true. I mean, we got to this ambulance, and not to denigrate these folks who did their best to try to help, but they couldn't find the tourniquet when we first got to the ambulance. So there was a big search for the tourniquet inside the back of the ambulance. And then the EMT didn't know how to use it. I ended up actually threading the tourniquet for the EMT to get it secure on Marshall's arm, because he kept yanking it, not threaded correctly. And it was just, he was causing Marshall a lot of pain, which frankly, at that point, I was a little bit glad for just because I wanted him to be
Right.
conscious.
Yeah.
But once we got the tourniquet on, and I could tell pretty quickly then that we did not have any bleeding, although he looked so white that I was still really concerned about the level of blood loss. But then they hooked him up to the monitor inside the ambulance where I could see that his blood pressure was rising once they had him on an IV. My dad heart was settling to some extent just in the ambulance ride because I felt like his vitals looked really stable.
Yeah.
But yeah, they took us to Harlingen. And so that was, and we got there with, tell him about that. I mean, we got there with a couple of other traumas. Two kids had gotten rolled over by a horse that night. So we got there with a bunch of crazy stuff going on at the same time.
Oh, man.
What's your
Yeah.
memory of the hospital?
Well, I don't remember a lot, but I remember them pushing me out of the ambulance and going through the room. And I remember going down the hallway, and then we sat in the ER room for a while waiting for the surgery on the kids that got rolled over by a horse to get done. So we were there for
A long
a
time.
good little while till like 1 a.m.
But
I mean, my son broke his arm playing soccer. He broke his ulna and his radius. I was actually in Brady deer hunting. My wife's a nurse practitioner. She calls. She goes, "Henry just broke his arm," and I'm like, "In the soccer game?" She's like, "Yeah." I said, "How do you know?" She goes, "I'm looking at his wrist, and I'm a medical professional. You moron. Like it's broken." I was like, you feel, and my son wasn't going to die, right? But I was out of town, and I was like, really, I almost was like, told them I need to go. But she was like, it's going to be okay. But they were at the hospital all night long because they started to push on it and he passed out from the pain. So we have to put him to sleep to set this thing. But yeah, I know that all night. My wife said, she called me as I was getting up to get in the deer blind the next morning. And she was like, we're on our way home. I was like, I'm on my way to go hunting, there's nothing worse.
Yeah, no, I mean, they triaged the situation and there were a couple of kids and somebody else who, were ahead of him because frankly, the trauma surgeon came out really quickly and told me as within probably 30 minutes of arrival that there was no arterial bleed and there was no nerve damage, which was just a huge relief to me. And frankly, I didn't even understand how that was possible given just the visual of what this wound looked like. I was thinking he was for sure going to be taking some time to bounce back, but it's amazing how quick this 13-year-old has healed.
I'm just looking at, so this is just the javelina it's just a skull, but I would say those top cutters are, almost inch and a half long. So that can definitely do some damage. What was the extent of the actual injury once you're in surgery and getting this wound patched back up?
How many stitches?
It was 25 stitches.
Wow. Yeah.
I think it was 20 on the bottom, and I had 5 little cuts on top that needed a stitch apiece.
Yeah, all those top jaws that you just showed basically put 4 or 5 big puncture wounds in the top of his arm that were deep. And then where those 2 front teeth come together, it just completely shredded the softer inside part of his arm. And I mean, it was scary to see because it was literally flapping open to the point that you could see his bone when there wasn't just an unbelievable amount of blood coming out of him.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder what the infection concern was. I mean, I'm sure you got put on antibiotics or whatever, but I don't imagine a javelina's mouth is one of the cleanest things out there.
I think maybe 3 of the little cuts on top got infected, and she had to pull the stitches out early.
Oh, really?
And we just had to keep cleaning them every night.
And
they're not.
Was this on your left arm?
Yeah, it was my left arm.
And do you have a gnarly scar there or what?
It's pretty good scar.
Yeah, right. Oh man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so Marshall, and I always ask people that have run-ins with wildlife, do you hold any ill will towards a javelina?
No.
What would you have done different?
Not followed it up. I probably should have just sat back where I shot it from and just let it bleed out until he got here.
Yeah.
There.
Live and learn. I remember I kind of taught myself how to deer hunt. My dad is a bass fisherman. He's not a hunter. The first buck I ever shot, I first of all shot him when he was running. He slowed down for a second, looked at me, and I was like, I don't know. I shot him, dropped to my knees and shot him. And then I watched him run into a thicket and bed down, and my dumb butt just walked over there and bumped him right out of there. And we found him 5 hours later, dead, right? But if I just would have left him there, it would have been an easy recovery. He would have died right there.
Yeah, the crazy thing about this, I mean, that Javelina was literally on his last leg. His arrow passed completely through it. He made a perfect shot right behind the shoulder. If he'd given this thing 5 minutes, probably he would have been doing, a photo op rather than a trip to a very scary trip to the emergency room.
Yeah.
Lesson learned. And, for me and for everybody out there, I mean, like, I feel like my kids are really, really capable and have hunted more than a lot of grown men, but I've told him that I don't know how many times, like, don't just wait for the follow-up until I'm there, but you never underestimate a kid getting excited.
For sure. And what did you do anything with the Javelina?
We got a skull mount.
You did? Okay, cool. My buddy got bit by a rattlesnake on his porch in Seymour. He walked out, and there was an electrical storm, so he just stepped out on the patio to watch the lightning, and like a little 12-inch rattler was up there to get warm and just tagged him, and he killed it and drove himself to the hospital. And then when he got back, he has it in a glass jar, probably displayed in his living room.
How bad was that?
Oh, he was in the hospital for a long time. I mean, like, let's say a week, but the amount of antivenom, I mean, thankfully his insurance covered it, but I mean, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in antivenom. It was quite a pretty spectacular hospital bill he racked up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also he's out in the middle of nowhere in Seymour. I mean, that's a town, right? But there's no viable trauma center there. I don't remember where he drove to, but he drove a good 30, 45 minutes. Drove himself, Still, things to think about when you're removed from, medical help. It's got to be prepared for sure.
We're definitely thinking about it more. This was one that you don't come away from the same, for sure.
I don't know how many people I've heard of actually get attacked by Javelina, though. It's not very common.
I mean, I've heard of dogs getting gutted and seen what they can do to a dog, and I've warned the kids for years, like, that's a animal you got to really pay attention to, because they can spin around in a second and tag you. But I've never actually heard of anybody actually getting bit.
Yeah. Well, Marshall, I'm glad you made a full recovery, man. Have you been hunting since it happened?
We went hunting the week after.
Of course, yeah. Awesome.
He's still looking for his knife. We've been back a number of times. We found everything
but the knife.
We found his arrow that had passed through the Javelina, and
man,
it was eerie that next morning going back and seeing all of his stuff still sitting there. I was, it was a huge deal. But
what did Mama think about all of this?
Well, Mom was home taking a nap when all this actually went down, so she met us at the hospital. But she's very, very cool, and understands our, passion for it and the whole outdoor lifestyle. She was not like, I think probably some spouses would be, where they were, just sort of mad at us all the way around. There was not any of that. It was just wanting to make sure he was fine.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I think that's about right.
I've never been in that situation with one of my kids, but my favorite lab I've ever had, we were duck hunting in Oklahoma, and it was like one of those cold snaps that you get in North Texas and southern Oklahoma that rare for us, where the ponds were frozen for like 4 days. We had this hole cut out of this pond, and I was letting her retrieve the ducks out of that. And we actually had an ice eater. Like, nobody in Texas has an ice eater, but this guy, my buddy, had one, and it was keeping the little pothole open. I would let her swim in there. Was not letting her go out on the ice. And I went behind the blind to take a leak, and these mallards came in, so I ducked down and boom, boom, buddy shoot. And I see one land on the bank. It's dead. I'm like, Belle, bird. And she goes towards the duck, and then boom, takes a 90-degree turn out onto the ice I didn't see that there was a duck that landed out there. She gets out to the middle of this pond, and I'm yelling at her, hey, you know, she's like, I'm getting that duck, and she falls through and was in there for 7 or 8 minutes. Couldn't get out. And so then, you know, I'm thinking, well, dog's going to die or I'm going to go get the dog. And luckily the truck was close and there was an axe in there. So I took all my clothes off, swam out there with the axe and started breaking the ice and got to her. She was fine. She swam right past me, went out on the bank. And I was good until I started going back. And then I was like, oof, this is bad. So they took the extension cord from the ice heater and threw it to me. And then they, you know, helped me pull me in, had the heater running in the truck right there. So I jumped in the truck. And after 15 minutes, I was good. But I'd say that's the hairiest situation I've ever been in as far as hunting goes. Way scarier than darting a rhino at 40 yards or, you know, hunting a Cape buffalo. This was like, I was thinking, and that went through my mind, like why I asked you about how Mama felt. I was like, I'm going to tell my wife and kids I killed their dog, you know, like.
Yeah, I've done that actually, similar thing. Not with ice, but you know, have made the crazy run out swim thinking your dog was not okay, where she'd actually gotten stuck on something, you know, had gotten her collar snagged on something and was just treading water. But that's a scary deal. But yeah, for me too. I mean, I've done the rhino dart and the Cape buffalo and all of that. And like they say over there, it's the dead ones that kill you. And that was certainly true even here for Avalon, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. The leopard is the one that I think is top on my bucket list that I haven't done. It's so expensive, but they say, I think you get 40 stitches for every second a leopard's on you, I think is what the going rate is, the price of doing business with a leopard.
That's actually what flashed in my mind when you were asking about the infection, because you always hear, you know, that cat bites are by far, you know, the worst as far as all the, you know, nastiness that gets transferred into the wound. But yeah, a leopard would be really, really terrible, especially considering their back legs are trying to gut you the entire time that you're on the ground, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, guys, I appreciate the time, Marshall. I'm so glad that you made a full recovery. Thank you for coming on, and just serve as a reminder to folks, you know, hey, have a tourniquet, be cognizant of these things. I'm going to have the conversation with my kids, which, you know, I probably wouldn't have done that. But it's something that we all need to think about as parents. So, Marshall, you know, I'm glad you had the wherewithal to put your belt, fasten a tourniquet out of that. Like I said, I don't think a lot of 13-year-olds would have. They probably would have been so much shocked that they wouldn't have thought to do that anyway. So good on you, man. And hope you get that big bull nil guy sometime soon.
I do too.
Appreciate it, man. It's been great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Y'all take care. Happy New Year.
All right, buddy. Be good.